The ledger hit the table so hard the oil lamp jumped. Hazel Boone stood in the doorway of the ranch house kitchen, her hands still damp from washing the supper dishes, and watched Paul Granger's face go the color of old ash. He had not heard her come in from the back. He did not know she was standing there. And for one terrible, clarifying moment, she could see everything he had been hiding from her since the day she arrived at Granger Ranch 8 months ago. The numbers running red across every column, the debt circled twice in someone else's handwriting, and the date stamped at the top of the page in brutal black ink. October 14th, 1883. 30 days. 30 days before the bank in Laramie could legally seize the land. Paul slammed the ledger shut with both palms flat on the cover, and the sound cracked through the kitchen like a rifle shot. His shoulders were heaving. His jaw was set so tight she could see the muscle working beneath his cheekbone, and his dark eyes were fixed on some middle distance that had nothing to do with the walls around him. He looked like a man standing at the edge of a cliff he had dug himself, refusing to look down. Hazel stepped back into the shadow of the hallway. Her heart was hammering. Not from fear. She had not been afraid of much since she crossed the Kansas border alone at 24 years old with $40 in her boot and a letter of employment in her coat pocket. What made her heart pound now was something quieter and far more dangerous than fear. It was the specific, acute pain of watching someone she had come to love more than she had intended destroy himself with his own pride. Because she knew. She had known for weeks. She had found the first sign in September, when she went to pay the feed merchant in town, and discovered that Paul's account had already been drawn down to almost nothing. She had covered the difference out of her own wages without mentioning it. She had told herself it was a temporary shortfall. But then she found the second sign, and the third, and by the time she found the letter from the Laramie Savings and Trust folded behind the flour tin on the shelf above the stove, a letter he did not know she had read, she understood the full architecture of the secret he was carrying. The ranch was failing, had been failing since before she came. And Paul Granger, who had inherited this land from his father and his father's father, who had ridden this range since he was old enough to hold reins, who spoke of Granger Ranch the way other men spoke of their children. Paul Granger would sooner have eaten glass than said those words aloud. She pressed her back against the hallway wall and listened to him breathe in the kitchen. Slow and deliberate, the way he breathed when he was fighting something down. She had learned his breathing patterns the way you learn the weather on a particular stretch of land. You paid attention whether you meant to or not. She had not meant to fall in love with him. That was the truth she carried in her own hidden pocket, pressed just as flat and secret as his ledger. She had come to Wyoming territory in the spring of 1883 as a housekeeper, answering an advertisement placed in a Denver newspaper by one Paul Granger of Carbon County, Wyoming. The advertisement had been dry as dust, 3 rooms to keep, cooking for 2 ranch hands and the owner, modest wages, room and board provided. Nothing in it to suggest that the man who wrote it had a laugh that arrived late and surprised him every time, or that he would leave wildflowers on the kitchen windowsill without ever acknowledging he had put them there, or that he would sit up 3 nights running with a sick calf and look genuinely devastated when the animal died on the 4th morning. Hazel had not been looking for love. She had been looking for work, and for distance from a life in Kansas City that had left her hollowed out in ways she was not yet ready to explain to anyone. But here she was, 8 months later, flattened against a hallway wall at 9:30 in the evening, listening to the man she loved try to breathe through the knowledge that he was about to lose everything his family had built, and she was the only person on earth who might be able to stop it. The question was whether she could do it without him knowing. Because if Paul Granger knew she had seen that ledger, if he knew she had read the bank's letter, if he knew she had already been quietly shoring up the cracks while he walked around pretending the walls were solid, the shame of it would burn him alive. She knew that about him as surely as she knew her own name. His pride was not arrogance. It was the bone-deep kind, the kind that comes from being the last man standing between a family legacy and the dirt. It was the kind of pride that, if broken publicly, might break the man entirely. So she said nothing. She stepped back farther into the hallway, turned quietly, and went upstairs to her room. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the dark and began to plan. She had been 19 years old when her father's dry goods store in Abilene, Kansas, burned down in the summer of 1878. She remembered watching her father stand in the street with his hat in his hands, staring at the smoking ruin, and she had made herself a promise that night. She would never be the kind of person who stood still when something could be done. She would never wait for someone else to solve the problem. And she had kept that promise every day since, through circumstances that would have leveled a less determined woman. She was 28 now, and Paul Granger was 31, though he carried himself with the gravity of a man who had been grown for considerably longer. He had never married. His mother had died when he was 16, his father 3 years ago, leaving him the ranch and what turned out to be considerably more debt than anyone had disclosed. The two ranch hands, old Denny Alcott and the younger one named Louis Reyes, had stayed on through loyalty as much as pay. But the cattle numbers had been falling since a brutal winter 2 years back had killed a third of the herd, and Paul had been borrowing against future profits that kept not materializing. Hazel knew all of this not because he had told her, but because she had paid close attention for 8 months. That was another thing about her. She watched, and she remembered, and she calculated with a precision that her schoolteacher in Abilene had once told her was wasted on a girl. She had carried that comment like a stone in her shoe ever since, and she used it to walk harder. She lay back on her bed and stared at the ceiling beams and thought about money. The ranch had 43 head of cattle left after last month's selling. Paul had priced them too low at the last drive because he was desperate for quick cash and too proud to negotiate. She had heard the buyer from Cheyenne talking to Denny in the yard, and she had seen the look on Denny's face when the number was settled. A careful flatness that meant the old man thought it was a mistake but knew better than to say so. 43 head of cattle. In the south pasture, the grass had come in good this season, better than the east and north. The cattle were healthy. If Paul could get them to market at the right price, through the right buyer, he could clear enough to pay down the bank debt substantially. But the right buyer wasn't in Laramie. The right buyer was a ranching consortium out of Cheyenne that Hazel had read about in the Wyoming Weekly Tribune, and they were specifically seeking high-quality beef in bulk before the December season. She had read that article 3 times. The problem was that Paul did not know the consortium existed, because he had stopped subscribing to the Tribune 6 months ago to save money, and she had only been reading the old copies she found in the shed. The second problem was the water rights. Granger Ranch sat adjacent to the Colton property to the west. Old Marcus Colton had died in August, and his estate was being settled by his nephew, a man named Gerald Colton, who had come down from Casper and made it known almost immediately that he intended to sell the Colton land to a mining concern. There was a creek running through both properties, Rye Creek, and if Gerald Colton sold to the mining concern, the upstream rights would change, potentially cutting the ranch's water access during dry months. It was a legal and practical catastrophe waiting to happen, and Paul did not know about it because Gerald Colton had only been in town 2 weeks, and Paul had not been to town in 3. Hazel had been to town. She lay in the dark and mapped it out like a general mapping a campaign. She needed to do 3 things simultaneously, and she needed to do them without Paul discovering that she was doing any of them. Because the moment he discovered it, his pride would force him to step in, take over, and possibly ruin the whole arrangement through sheer stubborn insistence on handling things himself. She fell asleep somewhere around midnight, with the plan mostly formed, and woke up before dawn with the rest of it. The next morning she cooked breakfast the same as always: salt pork, biscuits, black coffee, dried apple preserves, and watched Paul eat across the table with that particular look he got when he was trying to appear as though nothing was wrong. He was good at it, in the way that people are good at things they have practiced out of necessity. His eyes were slightly darker than usual, and the set of his mouth was a fraction tighter, but to anyone who didn't know him the way she did, he would have looked perfectly composed. She thought about how much she knew him, and the thought made something press warmly against the inside of her chest. "Denny and I are riding out to check the south fence line today," he said to no one in particular, cutting his biscuit in half with the side of his fork. "I'll need the wagon this morning," Hazel said, pouring herself coffee. "I need supplies from Hadley's." It was true. She did need supplies from Hadley's, but Hadley's general store was in the town of Rope Creek and the lawyer's office was in Rope Creek and so was the telegraph station. Paul looked up briefly. "Take Lewis with you." "I don't need an escort," she said, in the tone of voice she used when the subject was not worth discussing further. He looked at her for a moment in that steady, measuring way he had, the look that always made her feel simultaneously seen and somewhat unnerved, and then he nodded and went back to his biscuit. She was in town by 9 o'clock. The lawyer's office was a small, brown building between the barber and the post office, occupied by a man named Robert Fitch, who had come to Wyoming from Missouri 12 years ago, and settled into the quiet practice of property and contracts law with the contentment of a man who had found his exact right place. He was bald, methodical, and possessed of a memory for land records that bordered on the supernatural. Hazel had spoken with him once before, in August, when she had quietly asked him a few general questions about water rights in Wyoming territory while ostensibly dropping off a letter at the post office next door. She went directly to his office now and sat across from him and explained what she needed. "You want me to approach Gerald Colton about a water rights agreement," Fitch said, making a note on his pad. "A perpetual easement," Hazel said, "on behalf of Granger Ranch. I need it locked in legally before the Colton property changes hands. If the mining concern buys the land, the rights conversation becomes significantly more complicated and expensive." Fitch looked at her over his spectacles. "Does Mr. Granger know you're here?" "I'm handling household affairs on behalf of the ranch," Hazel said, which was neither a yes nor a no, and she held his gaze with perfect steadiness until he accepted it. "Gerald Colton is staying at the hotel," Fitch said. "He's been wanting to sell quickly. If Granger Ranch can offer him something that makes the transaction easier, he may be amenable to including the easement in the sale agreement at no additional cost." "What would make the transaction easier?" Hazel asked. "The Colton estate has several outstanding accounts in town. A buyer who agrees to settle those accounts as part of the purchase arrangement would be very attractive to Gerald. But Granger Ranch isn't buying the Colton land." "No," Hazel agreed. "But Granger Ranch could act as a reference for the mining concern, or it could offer Gerald a grazing lease on the south field for the period between sale and transfer, something that benefits Gerald immediately." She paused. "What does Gerald Colton actually want?" Fitch smiled slightly. "He wants to go back to Casper. He's a city man. He hates it here. He wants the whole thing settled and gone and done." "Then I'll write him a letter today," Hazel said. "A letter from Granger Ranch expressing neighborly gratitude for the late Mr. Marcus Colton's years of cooperation, and formally requesting a meeting to discuss the easement before the property changes hands. Professional and friendly. Gerald doesn't need to know the urgency." "That could work," Fitch said. She wrote the letter in Fitch's office using his pen and his stationery, and she left it addressed in her careful, plain script. Then she went to the telegraph station. The Cheyenne Ranching Consortium was called the High Plains Beef Association. She had found a contact name in the Tribune article, a man named William Hart, representing the association's purchasing committee. She composed a telegram that was 16 words long. 43 head prime beef, Carbon County, GRANGER, ranch available, immediate purchase, contact soonest, HARTE, response requested. She signed it with the ranch's name and left the telegraph address as Rope Creek, not Paul's name specifically. Then she bought the supplies she had listed: flour, salt, lamp oil, thread, dried beans, and she drove the wagon home under a sky that was the specific sharp blue of Wyoming in October, and she felt the faint, electric guilt of someone who is doing something right in a way that is not entirely above reproach. She told herself she was protecting the ranch. She told herself she was protecting Paul. Both of those things were true. She also told herself that she was not allowing herself to think about the fact that if the ranch was lost, she would have no reason to stay. And that thought, the thought of leaving, felt like a door closing on a warm room she had only just found the courage to walk into. She unpacked the supplies and started supper, and Paul came in from the fence line with mud on his boots and a cut on his left hand that he had wrapped in his own handkerchief. And he washed up at the basin and sat at the table and ate the stew she put in front of him, and neither of them said anything for a long time. "Good stew," he said finally. "The beans were fresh," she said. Another silence, not uncomfortable, the kind of silence that has texture to it. That means two people have gotten comfortable enough with each other to stop filling the air. "How was town?" he asked. "The same," she said. He nodded. He looked at his hands on the table and then looked up at her, and she saw the thing he was carrying flicker briefly across his face, a shadow of something raw and tired, and then he put it away again behind the careful composure. "Hazel," he said. She looked at him steadily. He opened his mouth and then closed it. He rubbed the back of his neck. She watched him gather something and then decide against it. "Nothing," he said. "Just, thank you for supper." She got up and took their plates to the basin and stood with her back to him so he couldn't see her face, and she breathed through the complicated tangle of tenderness and frustration and something that was very close to heartache, and she said, "You're welcome," in a perfectly ordinary voice. William Hart responded to her telegram in 3 days. The telegram was brief and businesslike. "Interested Granger ranch cattle. Send details grade and price. HARTE HPBA Cheyenne." Hazel sent the reply telegram from town on a Thursday when Paul was occupied with repairing the barn roof, giving Lewis the excuse that she was collecting mail. The mail, it turned out, included a response from Gerald Colton's hotel room delivered through Fitch's office. A handwritten note saying Gerald would be pleased to meet at his earliest convenience to discuss neighborly matters before the property transfer. She scheduled the meeting with Fitch for the following Monday and said nothing. That weekend was the first truly cold weekend of October, and they spent most of Saturday evening in the house because the wind came off the mountain in sheets, and even the horses didn't want to be out in it. Denny had gone to visit his sister in Rock Springs for the week. Lewis had gone to bed early. It was just Paul and Hazel in the main room of the ranch house, Paul at the desk going through papers. She noticed him carefully not looking at the ledger, and Hazel mending a tear in one of the linen curtains. The fire was bright and the wind was loud outside, and after a while Paul pushed back from the desk and looked across the room at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Open, somehow, less guarded than usual. "Do you ever miss Kansas?" he asked. She considered that honestly. "I miss my sister," she said. "She's in Abilene still. I write to her every few weeks." "What was it like, Abilene?" "Busy," she said. "And dusty," which is funny because you'd think Wyoming would be dustier, but Abilene had this particular kind of flat dust that got into everything. "My father's store smelled like dust and coffee and wood polish." She paused, threading her needle. "It burned down in 1878, the store. He rebuilt it eventually, but it was never quite the same after." "That's hard," Paul said quietly. "Watching something you built get taken from you." She looked up at him. He was staring at the fire. "He rebuilt it," she said. "That's the part I remember. He stood in the street and stared at what was left, and then he went to work." Paul was quiet for a moment. "My father would have done the same," he said. He was that kind of man. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I'm not always sure I'm that kind." "You are," she said before she thought about it. He looked at her then, directly and with some surprise, as though she'd said something he hadn't been expecting to hear. The fire cracked and the wind pushed at the shutters, and they looked at each other across the warm, lamplit room for a moment longer than was strictly ordinary. "You don't know that," he said, but he said it softly, without challenge. "I've been watching you work for 8 months," she said. "I know it." He held her gaze for a long moment and then looked back at the fire with something on his face that she couldn't quite read. Relief, maybe. Or some version of it that men like him allowed themselves. She went back to her mending and he stayed at the desk but didn't look at the papers, and the wind played against the house while the fire held steady, and the evening moved slowly, and neither of them seemed to want it to end. She met with Gerald Colton and Robert Fitch on Monday morning. Gerald was precisely what Fitch had described. A soft-handed, impatient man in a good coat who wanted nothing more than to conclude this inconvenient inheritance and return to his life in Casper. The easement conversation took 40 minutes. Hazel presented it as a formality of neighborly goodwill that would protect both properties during the transition period, and she let Fitch carry most of the legal language while she smiled and said exactly the right number of words in response to Gerald's questions, and by 11 o'clock it was done. The water rights easement would be included in the Colton property's sale documentation, perpetually binding, naming Granger Ranch as the protected party along the eastern bank of Rye Creek. The fee for Fitch's services was $8, which she paid from her own wages. She drove home feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time, the particular satisfaction of solving something large that no one else knew you'd solved. It was a double-edged feeling. The satisfaction was real. The loneliness of it was also real. On Tuesday, she sent William Hart the full details of the herd by telegram: breed, average weight, condition, and a price she had calculated based on current Cheyenne market rates from the most recent Tribune she could find. She priced them 15% higher than Paul had sold his last lot for. She asked for a November 1st meeting date in Rope Creek. Hart replied Wednesday, agreed to TERMS. Will send representative November 1 St. Rope Creek. Confirm ranch owner present. Ranch owner present. That was the problem. She had been doing all of this in Paul's name, as an agent of the ranch, which was arguably within the scope of a housekeeper's duties if you stretched the definition very broadly, and which was not something she had been explicitly authorized to do and which Paul did not know about. She had been operating in the sealed space of her own nerve, using the knowledge she had and the access she had and the abilities she had, and she had been genuinely telling herself that it was only a matter of setting up the opportunity, that once the meeting was arranged, Paul would naturally take it over and close it and never need to know how it came to exist. But a representative from the High Plains Beef Association traveling from Cheyenne to Rope Creek on November 1st to meet the owner of Granger Ranch was not something she could quietly arrange and then step back from. At some point between now and November 1st, she was going to have to tell Paul that a buyer was coming. And when he asked who arranged it, she was going to have to decide what to say. She drove home on Wednesday evening thinking about that decision, and found Paul standing at the corral fence in the last of the afternoon light, one boot up on the lower rail, watching his cattle in the south pasture. His hat was tipped back slightly, and his expression was the quiet, painful kind that she had come to recognize as the face he wore when he thought no one was watching. She stopped the wagon a few yards away and tied the horse to the post and walked over and stood beside him at the fence. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. They watched the cattle together, the steam of the animal's breath rising in the cold air, the last light going gold and flat across the pasture. "They're in good shape," she said finally. "Yes," he said, "better than you probably expected after last spring's dry months." He glanced at her sideways. "Lewis did good work in the south pasture." "So did you," she said. He was quiet again. Down the fence line, a red-tailed hawk was circling something in the grass. The light was failing fast, the way it did in Wyoming in October, dropping suddenly from gold to gray. "I've been thinking," Paul said and stopped. She waited. "I've been thinking about the spring drive," he said carefully. "If the winter's not too hard, if the herd holds steady, there might be a buyer in Cheyenne worth approaching." She felt a strange, complicated jolt in her chest. He had been thinking about Cheyenne. He was getting there on his own. If she gave him another week, maybe two, he might have come to the same conclusion she'd already acted on. And then it would have been his decision, his arrangement, his way, and everything would have been clean. But she had already sent the telegram. And William Hart's representative was coming November 1st. She made a decision. "There's a ranching consortium in Cheyenne," she said. "The High Plains Beef Association. I read about them in an old Tribune in the shed. They're buying before December, high volume, high price." Paul turned to look at her fully. "What?" "They're looking for exactly what you have," she said, keeping her voice perfectly even. 43 head of prime beef in Carbon County. Good grade, winter ready. I thought if you contacted them it might be worth your time." He was very still for a moment. "How long have you known about this?" "A few weeks," she said. "I wasn't sure it was worth mentioning until I'd read more about them." He looked at her for a long time, and she met his gaze and kept her face calm and gave away nothing of the telegrams, the fees, the water rights, the scheduled meeting. She hated every second of it. She hated lying to him by omission. But the alternative, telling him the full truth right now, felt like pulling a chair out from under a man who was already barely standing. "I'll look into it," he said, and turned back to the pasture. She nodded and went inside to start supper. The next 3 days she spent in a state of controlled tension that she managed by working harder than usual, scrubbing the kitchen floor, resealing the windows against the coming winter, baking the kind of complex, time-consuming food that required focus and kept her hands busy. She made beef and potato pies. She put up the last of the fall apples as preserves. She repaired 3 loose rungs on the kitchen chairs, which was probably not in her job description, but gave her something to do with her hands. Paul, meanwhile, had gone to town. She didn't know exactly when he went or what he found out, but on Thursday evening he came home with an expression she hadn't seen before: energized, cautious, uncertain, and working hard to contain all three. He sat at the supper table with a different quality of silence than usual. "I went to the telegraph station," he said when the meal was half done. "Did you?" She kept her voice neutral. "There's a buyer coming to town November 1st. He looked at her directly. "From Cheyenne. A man named Hart sent a representative. They're expecting to meet the owner of Granger Ranch." Her hands were steady. "That's good news." The telegraph operator said the original contact came from this ranch about a week and a half ago. He paused. "I wasn't in town a week and a half ago, Hazel." The silence between them was different now. She could feel it, the specific weight of a truth that is about to surface. She put down her fork and looked at him. She had already decided in the quiet hours of the previous night what she would do if this moment came. She would tell him the truth. She had not decided how he would receive it. "No," she said, "you weren't." He was very still. "You sent it." "Yes." He looked at her for a long time. The lamp between them burned without flickering. Outside, one of the horses shifted in the barn, and the sound carried clearly through the cold night. "The water rights on Rye Creek," he said slowly. "Gerald Colton came by the day before yesterday. He said the easement was already drafted. He said the lawyer in town, Fitch, had contacted him on behalf of the ranch." His voice was precise and very quiet. "I didn't send Fitch." "No," she said. "Hazel." He said her name like a question that didn't know which direction it was going. "The Colton property was being sold to a mining concern," she said, still in the same quiet, straight voice. "If the sale went through without an easement, you'd lose upstream water rights on Rye Creek during dry months. I found out when I was in town in late September. Gerald Colton was leaving at the end of October. If it wasn't handled before then, it would cost significantly more to deal with after and might not succeed at all." She folded her hands on the table. "So I had Fitch draw up the easement. I attended the meeting. I paid Fitch's fee." "You paid his fee," Paul said. $8. A muscle moved in his jaw. "Out of your wages?" "Yes." He stood up from the table and walked to the window and stood with his back to her, one hand braced on the window frame, looking out at the dark yard. She watched his shoulders. They were carrying everything again, all that weight, and she could see the particular tension that meant he was fighting something that pride demanded he fight. "You should have told me," he said. "You would have handled it yourself," she said, "and possibly too late and certainly at greater expense." He turned around and his face was a complicated country anger and embarrassment, and something underneath both of those that she couldn't name yet. "That wasn't your decision to make. Someone had to make it," she said, and she said it simply, without challenge, without any edge in it. Just the plain truth of it set down between them. He stared at her. The anger was still there, but it was shifting into something else, something more confused and more honest. "How long?" he asked. "How long have you been? How much do you know?" "I found the letter from the bank in September," she said. "The one behind the flour tin." The color left his face. "I wasn't looking for it," she said quietly. "I was putting the flour away. I saw the seal and the date and I understood what it meant." He put both hands on the back of his chair and gripped it and looked down at the table, and she watched the full weight of it settle on him, the weight of being known, of having the secret he'd been carrying alone for months be seen and named by someone else while he stood in his own kitchen. "Paul," she said. He didn't look up. "I didn't do it to undermine you," she said. "I didn't do it to make you feel small. I did it because the ranch was going to be taken from you, and you were working yourself half to death trying to hold it together alone, and She stopped, started again. "I couldn't watch that happen and do nothing. That's not who I am." He was very quiet. She could hear him breathing. "The Cheyenne buyer," he said after a long moment, still not looking up. "The price you quoted, Hart. How did you calculate that?" "Current market rates from the October Tribune," she said. "Plus 15% for quality premium. The herd is in better condition than your last sale lot, and the association is buying at volume, which means they'll pay a higher unit price to secure the quantity." He finally looked up. He looked at her the way people sometimes look at things they haven't seen clearly before, even though those things have been in front of them the whole time. "You priced it higher than I would have." "Yes. Why didn't you just tell me?" he asked, and now the anger was completely gone from his voice, and what was left was something rawer and more real. "About the bank letter, about all of it. Why didn't you just talk to me?" She held his gaze and told him the truth. "Because I knew you were ashamed," she said. "And I knew that if I acknowledged what I'd seen, it would hurt you in a way that was unnecessary. You weren't failing from laziness or carelessness. You were failing because 2 winters in a row were brutal and the cattle market dropped and your father left debts that weren't your fault. None of that makes you less than what you are. But I knew you wouldn't be able to hear it that way. Not then." He was looking at her with that expression she'd seen at the corral fence, the open, unguarded one, but deeper now, more complicated, more fragile. "So you just did it," he said, quietly, without saying anything. "Yes." He pulled out his chair and sat back down heavily, like a man who has set down something very heavy and isn't sure how to stand without it. He put his elbows on the table and ran both hands through his hair and looked at the lamp for a long moment. "The meeting on November 1st, he said, "with Hart's representative." "You should go," she said. "It's your cattle and your ranch and your negotiation. I set up the contact. The rest is yours." He looked at her steadily. "Will you come with me?" She was not expecting that. "I know the numbers better than you think I do," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, slightly wry, slightly self-aware, that was new. "I also know that you apparently know them better than I do, so," he held her gaze. "Will you come?" "Yes," she said, "if you want me there." "I want you there," he said, and he said it with a simplicity and directness that had nothing professional about it. The silence between them after that was different from all the other silences. It was the kind of silence that has crossed a threshold it cannot uncross. She looked at the lamp. He looked at the table. The house creaked gently around them in the wind. "I owe you $8, he said finally. She laughed, and it surprised them both, a short, real laugh that she hadn't expected, and he smiled. And it was the late-arriving kind, the one that surprised him, and the room was suddenly warm in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. That night, after she had gone upstairs, She lay on her bed and pressed her hand flat against her sternum and felt her heartbeat under her palm and thought very seriously about the situation she was in. She had been a hired housekeeper. She had overstepped. She had been hiding things from the man who employed her for months, even if the things she was hiding were actions taken entirely for his benefit. And now he had asked her to sit beside him in a business meeting, and the way he said her name, her actual name, her full name, Hazel, not Miss Boone, had not sounded like an employer at all. She thought about that for a long time before she slept. In the morning she came downstairs and Paul was already at the stove, which never happened. He was making coffee. He had made a hash of it, the water was already boiling too fast, and he was frowning at the pot with the expression of a man solving a problem that was beneath his usual difficulty level but was still defeating him. She came up beside him without a word, turned the heat down, took the pot off for 30 seconds to let it settle and then put it back. He watched her do it. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome." He poured her a cup first and she noticed that too. The week before November 1st was different than the weeks before it. Not dramatically, the work was the same, the days were the same, the Wyoming sky was the same hard, cold blue, but the quality of the air between them had changed. It was warmer, more honest. Paul started talking to her at breakfast more than he had, not about important things necessarily, but about the daily things, the fence line, the cattle, what Lewis had found near the western boundary, what Denny's sister had written in her last letter, and she answered and they talked, and it was ordinary and it was the best part of her day. He started asking her opinion on things, not about domestic matters but about ranch matters. He would mention a situation or a problem in a casual way, almost as though he were thinking aloud, and then he would go quiet and look at her and wait, and she would tell him what she thought, and he would consider it seriously. Once he disagreed with her and they argued about it for 10 minutes across the breakfast table, and it was the most fully alive she had felt in years, that back and forth, that meeting of two minds taking each other seriously. He was wrong, by the way. She told him so. He proved it 2 days later by doing it his way and getting exactly the result she'd predicted, and he came in from the field with a look of sheepish self-awareness that she found completely devastating. "You were right," he said. "I know," she said, and brought him coffee. He took the cup and their fingers were close on the handle and neither of them moved for just a moment, a half-second before she let go. On October 30th, she was in the kitchen sorting through the accounts. Paul had started letting her see the full ledger now, without discussion, as though the decision had been made somewhere between them without requiring words, when Denny came in and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands. "Miss Boone," he said, in the careful voice of a man with something difficult to say. "You should know. I know about the bank letter. I've known for a few months. Old Marcus Colton told me about the Granger debt before he passed. He was worried about Paul." She looked up at him steadily. "All right." Denny was in his late 50s, weathered and spare and deeply loyal to this land in a way that was almost more personal than Paul's own attachment. He had worked for Paul's father for 20 years. "I should have done something," he said. "I didn't know what to do, and then he stopped. He looked at her with a kind of frank, respectful honesty. "What you've been doing, the meeting in town, the water rights. Lewis told me about the Cheyenne buyer." She said nothing. "Thank you," Denny said. "That's all, just." "Thank you," she nodded once. He put his hat back on and went out and she turned back to the ledger, and she was very careful to keep her face neutral until she heard the door close behind him, and then she let herself feel, for one moment, the full relief of having been seen by someone else without judgment, without the complexity of Paul's pride in between. Just, "Thank you." It was enough. November 1st arrived cold and overcast, a thin steel sky pressing down on the mountains. Paul had on his good coat, which she had brushed the night before. She wore the dark green wool dress she had brought from Kansas City, which was the nicest thing she owned, and which she told herself she was wearing because it was a professional occasion. The representative from the High Plains Beef Association was a man named Thomas Edgar, a compact and efficient Scotsman with a clipboard and a handshake like a door latch. He met them at the hotel in Rope Creek, which was the largest establishment available for a meeting, and he asked Paul 3 questions very fast to establish whether he was serious and whether the cattle were what had been described, and then he opened his clipboard and got down to numbers. The negotiation took 2 hours. Paul was good at it. Better than she'd expected, actually. He was straight-backed and measured, and he didn't rush, and he didn't give things away. Edgar tried to bring the price down twice, and Paul held firm, using the language of supply scarcity and seasonal urgency in a way that was effective without being aggressive. When Edgar pushed on the question of delivery timeline, Paul looked at Hazel briefly, and she gave him the smallest nod, and he named a date 2 weeks out that worked for both sides. At the end of it, Thomas Edgar offered his hand and Paul shook it, and the price they had agreed on was higher than anything Granger Ranch had sold at in 3 years. It wasn't everything. It was not going to clear the full bank debt, but it was enough, combined with a reasonable repayment arrangement, to hold the ranch through the winter and into spring. Hazel had already run those numbers in her head twice and confirmed it. They walked out of the hotel and onto the main street of Rope Creek into the cold November air, and Paul exhaled a long breath that turned to vapor and rose and disappeared, and he stood very still for a moment looking at the street. "That's more than I've sold for in years," he said. "The price was right," she said. "The market moved in your favor this season and your herd condition justified it." He turned to look at her. He was standing close enough that she could see the detail of his face clearly, the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the 2 days of dark stubble he hadn't quite gotten to before the meeting, the particular way he held his expression when he was feeling something he hadn't yet found language for. "I owe you considerably more than $8, he said. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "Hazel," he said her name very carefully. "The water rights easement, the Cheyenne contact. The accounting you've been quietly fixing for months. I know it's more than $8. "I didn't do it for payment," she said. "I know you didn't," he held her gaze. "That's what I'm saying." The cold wind moved down the street and she pulled her coat closer and his hand came up, not quite touching her, just there at the edge of intention, and then they were both very still. "Why did you come here?" he asked. "Last spring. Of all the advertisements in all the papers, why this one?" "It was honest," she said. "Most of them weren't. Yours said exactly what it was. 3 rooms, cooking for 2 hands, and an owner, modest wages. Nothing flowery about it. I liked that." "I'm not very good at flowery," he said. "I know," she looked up at him. "I like that about you." They stood in the street in Rope Creek in the November cold and looked at each other, and Paul Granger reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face with a gesture so careful and deliberate that it could not have been accidental, and she felt it from her face all the way down to her feet. "I have not handled this well," he said quietly. "Any of it. The ranch, the finances. Letting it get to the point it got to." He paused. "Not telling you." "You didn't owe me an explanation," she said. "I was your housekeeper." "You were never just my housekeeper," he said. "You know that." She did know it. She had known it for months, from the wildflowers on the windowsill and the way he waited at the table until she sat down, and the way he said her name differently than he said anyone else's name. "I didn't know how to ask you for help," he said. "I didn't know how to admit that I needed it. I kept thinking if I just worked harder, if I just pushed through 1 more week, I'd find a way to fix it myself without anyone knowing it had been broken." He looked briefly away out at the street and the muscle in his jaw moved. "That was stupid." "It was proud," she said, not unkindly. "Same thing sometimes," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "Sometimes." He looked back at her and there was something completely open in his face now. No careful composure left at all, just the man himself standing in the cold morning, which was a thing she had been slowly, patiently, quietly earning for 8 months. "I don't know how to say this plainly," he said. "Try," she said. "I would very much like you to stay," he said. "Not as," he made a slight movement with his hand, "not as the housekeeper. I would like you to stay because I think you are the most remarkable person I have met in my life, and the ranch is better and I am better, and the days are better with you in them. And I have been trying not to say that for approximately 6 months because I didn't think I had the right to say it when the ranch was in the state it was in." He stopped. That's why I couldn't tell you about the bank letter. Not just pride. If I told you how bad it was, I'd have to admit that I had nothing to offer you. And I wanted to offer you something worth having. Hazel looked at him for a long moment. The street was quiet, a buckboard moving slowly past at the far end, the blacksmith's hammer audible from 2 doors down. "Paul," she said. "You silly man," he blinked. "I covered the feed merchant account in September out of my own wages," she said. "I paid a lawyer's fee. I spent 3 weeks conducting secret negotiations on your behalf. I know your cattle numbers and your water rights, and I have read your bank correspondence." She looked at him steadily. "Do you think I did all of that because it was in my employment contract?" He stared at her. And then that smile came, the late one, the surprised one, and it was larger this time, fuller, the kind that changed his whole face. "No," he said. "I suppose not." She took a step toward him, and he met her halfway, and when he kissed her there in the main street of Rope Creek with the cold November sky above them, it tasted like relief and warmth and the particular sweetness of a thing that has been carefully, patiently, quietly earned. They drove back to the ranch in the wagon with the heater brick at their feet and the sky beginning to clear toward afternoon, and Paul kept his hand over hers on the seat the whole way, and neither of them talked much, but it was the fullest silence she had ever sat in. Back at the ranch, Denny looked at them as they came through the yard and gave a slow, satisfied nod and said absolutely nothing, which was exactly right. Lewis looked up from the fence post he was working on, took in the situation and grinned broadly and said, "Finally," which Paul told him to mind his own business about, though he was smiling when he said it. The Cheyenne Drive happened on November 14th. Paul rode out with Denny and Lewis and the 43 head, and Hazel stayed at the ranch and spent the 4 days they were gone writing a detailed financial projection for the spring season and repairing the chimney mortar on the east side of the house, which she had been meaning to do since August. She wrote to her sister Clara in Abilene, a longer letter than usual, telling her about Wyoming and the ranch and a man named Paul, and she found it was surprisingly easy to describe him clearly. Paul came back on the 17th with the cattle sold and the payment in a bank draft in his inside coat pocket, and a look on his face that was the cleanest thing she had seen since spring. He handed the bank draft to her at the kitchen table and said, "What do we do with this?" And the we of it settled into her like something she hadn't known she was cold without. They went to the Laramie Savings and Trust together on November 22nd. They met with the bank manager, a humorless man named Archer who wore his watch chain like a decoration of personal virtue, and they made a substantial payment against the outstanding debt and arranged a structured repayment schedule for the balance. And when they walked out of the bank into the clear Laramie afternoon, Paul stopped on the sidewalk and put his head back and breathed in the cold air as though he'd been underwater for a very long time. "All right," Hazel said. "Better than all right," he said. He looked at her. "I need to ask you something." "Ask. Will you marry me?" She considered making him work harder for it. She considered pointing out that he had proposed on a sidewalk outside a bank on a weekday morning, which was not the most romantic setting in Wyoming territory. She considered all of this for approximately 3 seconds. "Yes," she said. He kissed her again, right there on the Laramie sidewalk, and a man with a briefcase walked around them with a look of mild disapproval, and neither of them noticed. They were married in Rope Creek on December 18th, 1883, in the small white church on the north end of Main Street that was also used for town meetings, and, once memorably, for a livestock auction when the weather made the regular venue unavailable. The minister was a young man from Illinois named Pastor Eames, who performed the ceremony with genuine warmth. Denny Alcott was Paul's witness. Hazel's sister Clara had traveled up from Abilene on the stage and stood beside her with tears running down her face from approximately the moment the ceremony began, which she would later attribute to the cold air, and which convinced no one. Hazel wore a cream-colored dress that she and Clara had worked on together over 3 evenings at the ranch house, cutting and sewing by lamplight, while Paul tactfully found reasons to be in the barn. Paul wore his good coat and a new shirt, and his expression for the entire ceremony was the open, unguarded one, the one she had been collecting like pressed flowers since the autumn. The celebration afterward was small and warm. Everyone from the ranch, Robert Fitch, a few of the neighboring families, the telegraph operator who had, as it turned out, been highly invested in the outcome of events since October. Someone produced a fiddle, and someone else produced a bottle of whiskey, and the evening lasted considerably longer than anyone had planned. At some point near the end of the evening, when the fire in the hotel's public room had burned down to orange coals and most people had drifted into smaller conversations, Hazel found herself standing with Denny near the window, both of them looking out at the December night. "When did you know," Denny asked her, "that the ranch was worth saving the way you saved it?" She thought about it honestly. "The first week," she said. "I saw how he looked at it. The way he rode out every morning and looked at the land before anything else. The way he talked about his father's work on the east fence line, not in words, but in how carefully he maintained it. You don't look at something that way and let it go if there's anything to be done about it." Denny was quiet for a moment. "His father was the same way," he said, "proud as iron, needed someone to see around the pride." He looked at her with the frank respect she'd seen in the kitchen months ago. "You did that." "He did most of it himself," she said. "I just moved a few things out of the way." Denny shook his head slowly and smiled, and they both looked at Paul across the room, who was laughing at something Lewis had said, the full, late-arriving laugh that she loved. And the night outside was cold and black and starred, and inside it was warm, and she was married, and the ranch was saved, and everything was, for the first time in a long time, the way it was supposed to be. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was hard but not cruel. They lost 2 cattle to the cold in January, which was better than any of them had feared. Paul and Hazel worked side by side through the worst of it, breaking ice on the water troughs in the mornings, checking the hay stores, keeping the stove fed through the long frozen nights. It was not comfortable or romantic work. It was cold and exhausting and smelled like cattle and wood smoke, and it was the most at home she had ever felt in her life. She had taken over the ranch accounts officially now, with Paul's full knowledge and agreement, and she reorganized the ledger system over the course of 3 evenings, creating a separate column for capital expenditures and a rolling projection page that allowed them to see 3 months forward at any given time. Paul sat beside her for all 3 evenings and asked questions and learned it, and she taught him without condescension and he learned without embarrassment, and by the end of it he understood his own finances better than he had in 3 years. "Why didn't you just do this from the beginning?" he asked, studying the new projection page. "Because it wasn't my ranch," she said. He looked at her steadily. "It is now." She felt that land somewhere deep and permanent. In February, they received a letter from the High Plains Beef Association. William Hart himself had written a brief, businesslike letter expressing satisfaction with the November transaction and inquiring about availability for a late spring purchase of similar volume. The price he quoted for a spring contract was even better than November's. Paul read it at the breakfast table and then looked up at Hazel with an expression that was equal parts gratitude and wonder and love, and he said nothing, and she nodded once, and that was enough. She wrote back to Hart confirming their interest. By spring they had also taken on an additional contract with a Laramie hotel that needed regular beef supply, a smaller and steadier arrangement that Hazel had negotiated on one of her trips to town in March. It wasn't a fortune. It was reliable income on top of the cattle sales, which was considerably better than a fortune in the long run. The bank debt was being paid down on schedule. The ranch was not thriving yet, not in the way it would eventually, but it was solid. It was standing. On the morning of April 8, 1884, Hazel sat at the kitchen table in the early light with a cup of coffee and a specific knowledge she had been holding for 4 days while she confirmed it to herself. And when Paul came in from the morning check, she put her cup down and looked at him and said, simply, "I'm expecting." He went very still. "A baby," she clarified, as though this required clarification. The expression that moved across his face was not the careful composure or the controlled gravity or any of the faces she had catalogued over the months. It was something entirely unguarded and young and completely unprepared for, and it was one of the most beautiful things she had ever seen. He came around the table and knelt down beside her chair and took her hands and looked at her with that open, unarmored face and said, "Are you all right?" "I'm perfectly fine," she said, "more than fine." He brought her hands up and pressed his mouth to her knuckles and held still for a moment, and she felt him breathe. "A baby," he said quietly to her hands. "In the fall," she said. "I think early October." He looked up at her. "Last fall we were saving the ranch," he said. "This fall we'll have a baby. We'll be busy," she agreed. He laughed, the full surprised laugh, and stood up and pulled her gently to her feet and held her carefully, as though she were something he had not quite believed he was allowed to have, and she put her head against his chest and listened to his heartbeat, which was considerably faster than usual. She wrote to Clara that same evening. The letter took 3 drafts because she kept writing too much. The spring cattle sale went better than projected. Paul rode out to Cheyenne himself to finalize the terms with William Hart in person, because he had learned that building the relationship directly mattered, and he came back with a signed contract for the fall drive as well that extended the arrangement through to 1885. He spread the papers on the kitchen table and showed her all the figures, and they sat together and went through every line, and she caught 2 small errors in the payment schedule terms that she had fetched correct before it was finalized. And Paul watched her catch them with an expression that made her feel like the most capable person in the room, which she might have been but had never previously had someone look at her as though it were simply obvious. Denny's health began to decline in June. It was not a sudden thing but a quiet one. He got slower, stiffer, and then in July he began having chest pains that the doctor in Rope Creek described in terms that meant he needed to reduce his workload significantly. He was 59 years old and had spent 40 of those years doing the physical labor of a ranch hand, and his body had made its accounting. Paul handled this badly at first. Not unkindly, he was never unkind, but he went quiet in the specific way that meant he was trying to manage something painful on his own, and he pushed himself harder to cover Denny's share of the work, which Hazel watched with the same mix of tenderness and exasperation she had felt on the night of the ledger. This time she said something. "You're going to work yourself into the same condition if you don't hire help," she said one evening in July, directly, no preamble. He opened his mouth and she gave him a look that was not unkind but was unequivocal, and he closed it. "We can afford it," she said. "The spring sale covered the next bank payment with money left. A second hand, someone young and willing, would cost less per month than you think and would save you and Louis enough time that you could take on the additional fencing work in the north field that you've been putting off." She paused. "I've already done the numbers." He looked at her for a long moment. The look had changed over the months. It no longer had the defensive edge it used to carry when she showed him things he hadn't seen. It was just honest, clear, the look of a man who trusted her completely. "All right," he said. "Put it to Louis and let's see who he knows." Louis knew a young man named Tomás Verla from down south of the Colorado border, 20 years old, hard-working and honest, and in need of reliable work. Tomás arrived in August with a bedroll and a good horse and an immediate willingness to muck out stables without being asked twice, which endeared him to everyone on the property within 48 hours. With Tomás covering a share of the daily work, Paul was able to take on the north field fencing project that had been waiting, and by the end of August, the ranch's physical infrastructure was in better condition than it had been since before his father died. Denny stayed. He moved to lighter duties, managing the supply orders, tending the vegetable garden that Hazel had started in May, keeping the equipment in repair. He seemed, if anything, happier for the change, and his chest pains reduced. He sat on the porch in the evenings with his pipe and a pleasant expression, and watched the ranch go on around him, and said regularly that the place had never been run better, which he said to anyone who would listen, and which Paul accepted with the slight discomfort of a man who knows he is being told a true thing that he is still learning to receive. Hazel's pregnancy progressed without difficulty. She did not slow down as much as Paul would have preferred, which was a source of ongoing gentle disagreement between them. He kept asking her to let things go, and she kept declining to let things go, and the negotiated middle ground they reached was that she would stop lifting anything heavier than 30 pounds and would accept his help without argument when offered. She accepted his help without argument more easily than he expected. She had learned that accepting help was not the same as needing rescue. That was the thing she had always understood intellectually, and was now beginning to understand in her body, in the daily practice of a partnership, which was a different kind of understanding entirely. On September 30th, 1884, she woke before dawn with the knowledge that the day had arrived. She lay in the dark for a moment and listened to Paul sleeping beside her, and then she put her hand on his shoulder and said his name. The Rope Creek doctor, a woman named Dr. Margaret Hewitt, who had come to Wyoming from Philadelphia 5 years ago and was one of the few female physicians in the territory, arrived at the ranch by 9 o'clock. Paul spent the waiting hours in the most transparently agonized state Hazel had ever seen him in. He could not sit still, could not concentrate, went in and out of the barn 3 times without any apparent purpose, and was twice sent out of the room by Dr. Hewitt in a tone that permitted no argument. The baby was born in the early afternoon. A boy, dark-haired with his father's wide dark eyes, and as loud as the Wyoming wind, which Paul took as a personal compliment. Paul came into the room when Dr. Hewitt called him and stood beside the bed and looked down at the child in Hazel's arms with the completely unarmored expression, the real one, the open one, and she thought she had never seen a man so unprepared for happiness look so completely right inside of it. He sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms and watched him hold the boy with the careful, slightly terrified reverence of a man who has never held anything this important and knows it. "He's small," Paul said. "He won't be for long," Dr. Hewitt said dryly from across the room. Paul looked at Hazel with something in his face that she would not have been able to name with a single word. Love was in it, yes, but also gratitude and wonder and the specific quality of someone who has come through a hard country and arrived somewhere he did not quite believe existed. "James," she said. "I was thinking James." "James," he said, looking at the baby. "Yes." Denny, when he met James on the porch that evening, simply said, "Good. The ranch needed a future." Then he went back to his pipe, which was as effusive as Denny got, and which Paul found more moving than any speech. Clara came up from Abilene in October and stayed 3 weeks and was enormously useful and almost as enormously opinionated, which Hazel had expected, and Paul handled with such patient good humor that Clara told Hazel privately he was the best thing that ever happened to you except for the baby, which Hazel did not disagree with. The fall of 1884 was full. Not just full with work, though it was that, but full in the way that a life is full when all its important parts are present and in the right places. James grew rapidly and loudly, and with great enthusiasm for being carried across the ranch yard, which his father did every morning while Hazel watched from the kitchen window with her coffee, and the particular contentment of someone who has built something that is genuinely working. The bank debt was paid off completely in March of 1885. Paul came home from Laramie on a Tuesday afternoon and found Hazel in the kitchen garden turning the early spring soil, and he walked over and stood beside her and said, "It's done." And she straightened up and looked at him, and the relief on his face was the clean, permanent kind. She had known it was coming. She had been tracking the numbers and knew March's payment would clear the balance, but she let it be his news in the moment of it, let it be his victory to name aloud. "Done," she said. "Free and clear," he said. She pulled off her gardening gloves and looked at her hands and then at him, and he was looking at the house, at the fence, at the south pasture, where the cattle were beginning to move with the warming afternoon, and his face was the face she had seen that first time at the corral fence, the open, painful one, except it was not painful anymore. It was just open, free of whatever had been pressing on it since before she came. "Your father built something worth keeping," she said. He looked at her. "So did I," he said, and she understood that he was not talking only about the ranch. That summer Tomás Verla proved himself so thoroughly capable and reliable that Paul promoted him to a formal foreman role, which was a word Tomás was visibly very pleased to have attached to himself. Lewis, who had been at the ranch longest after Denny, was given a pay increase that he received with great dignity, and then immediately used to send the bulk of it home to his family in New Mexico, which Paul found out about from Denny, and which he never mentioned to Lewis directly, but which informed the way he thought about wages going forward. In June of 1885, Hazel realized she was expecting again. This time she told Paul over supper, same as before, and his response was faster. The face changed more quickly to the open one, less time spent in adjustment. "Early winter this time, I think," she said. "James will be 1.5, Paul said. "He'll be fine," she said. "Children manage." "He is loud enough for 3 children already," Paul said. "That's your side," she said. He looked at her with the slight wounded dignity of a man who wants to argue a point and knows he cannot, and she smiled at her supper plate. The second child was born in December 1885. A girl this time, arrived in the first hard week of winter with the snow coming sideways outside, and Dr. Hewitt at the ranch by necessity, staying the night because the roads were impassable. Paul spent the waiting hours by the fire with James on his knee, reading him the picture book Clara had sent from Abilene, and James fell asleep against his father's chest at some point in the process, and when Dr. Hewitt came out and said mother and daughter were both well, Paul sat very still for a moment with James sleeping against him, and said thank you in a voice that had a great deal of weight in it. They named the girl Ruth. She was quieter than James, which they took as an interesting development, and she had Hazel's coloring, the light brown hair, the hazel eyes that her mother's name had always been most aptly named for, and she seemed from her first weeks to be watching the world with a calm, measuring attention that Paul found immediately familiar. "She's going to be just like you," he said, looking at Ruth in the cradle. "Good," Hazel said. "I'm not sure the ranch can survive 2 of you," he said, but his voice had the tone it always had when he was happiest. The spring of 1886 brought the first genuinely good news from every direction at once. The bank account in credit rather than debt, a new cattle contract with a larger volume than any previous year, the North Field fully fenced and producing, and a letter from Clara announcing that she was engaged to a railroad man from Topeka and would be married in September. Hazel wrote back immediately with congratulations and a detailed list of questions about the railroad man that Clara answered in a subsequent letter with equal detail and some amusement. Paul found Hazel in the kitchen one evening that spring, sitting at the table with the ledger open and James asleep on her lap and Ruth in the cradle nearby, and a look on her face that was entirely absorbed in what she was doing. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her, the lamplight and the sleeping child and the careful, focused attention she brought to the numbers, and he thought about the advertisement he had placed in the Denver newspaper 3 years ago. The dry, functional advertisement that said exactly and only what it was, and the extraordinary person who had answered it, and what she had made of what she found. He went and sat across from her, and she looked up, and he said nothing in particular, just looked at her, and she looked back at him in the familiar way, reading the look the way she read everything he said without words, and then she smiled just slightly and went back to the ledger. "There's a small discrepancy in the April hay account," she said, without looking up. "Which column?" he said, pulling the ledger toward him slightly so they could look at it together. She showed him. He found the source of the discrepancy in about 3 minutes, a transposition error in the date column, and corrected it while she held James steady on her lap, and they sat side by side at the kitchen table in the lamplight with their children sleeping nearby, and the ranch accounts in order and the debt paid and the land free and clear. And it was the most ordinary evening imaginable, and it was everything. He put the pen down and looked at the corrected ledger, and then at her. "I was not a man who deserved the luck he got," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "I wasn't luck," she said. "I was a specific choice I made about a specific advertisement in a Denver newspaper." "I know," he said. "That's the lucky part, that you made that choice." She considered him for a moment. "You wrote an honest advertisement," she said. "That was your part. You put the truth on the paper without embellishment, and someone who valued honesty answered it. That's not luck, Paul, that's cause and effect." "Are you always going to do this?" he asked. "Do what?" "Find the logical underpinning of the things I say." "Probably," she said. He smiled, the full, surprised, late-arriving smile, the one she had been collecting since October of 1883. "Good," he said. Outside, the spring night was opening up over Wyoming, the sky going from dark blue to the first faint edge of something warmer, and the horses were quiet in the barn, and the grass was coming in on the south pasture, and Rye Creek was running clear with the snowmelt from the mountains on their side of the bank, protected, permanent, exactly as she had arranged. The ranch was alive. The family was real. The ledger was balanced. And Paul Granger, who had once stood in a kitchen alone with a closed ledger, and tried to breathe through the weight of everything he would not admit, sat at that same table now with his wife beside him and their children sleeping nearby and his hands resting on the open pages. And there was nothing in his face he was hiding from anyone. Hazel looked at the window, at the rising night sky over the mountains, and thought about the woman who had arrived at this house 8 months pregnant with plans and secrets, and a $40 inheritance from a burned-down store in Kansas. And she thought about what you do when you love something enough to save it quietly and say nothing. And she thought about how that silence had eventually led here. To this table, this light, this man, this life. And she was very sure, looking at it all in the clear, uncomplicated way she looked at everything, that it had been worth every hidden action and every careful word and every silent night in which she had worked at the edges of someone else's. Pride making a space where love could eventually stand in the open and not be ashamed. She put her hand over Paul's on the table. He turned his palm up and held it. Outside, the Wyoming spring went on without witnesses, without ceremony, the way good things often do, quietly and with great persistence, and with no intention of stopping. In the years that followed, Granger Ranch became known in Carbon County as one of the best-run operations in the territory. Not the largest, not the most famous, but the kind of place that people pointed to when they wanted an example of how careful management and genuine partnership could build something lasting out of difficult ground. Paul was credited with the turnaround by most people who spoke of it publicly, because he was the owner and the name on the deed, and that was how things were credited in 1880s Wyoming. Hazel was credited by everyone who actually knew. Denny Alcott lived to see Ruth's 4th birthday and James's 5th, and he died in the winter of 1889 in his own bunk in the ranch house he had lived and worked in for over 20 years, quietly and in his sleep, which was, as he himself had once told Hazel, the only way to go if you had to go. Paul and Louis and Tomaz and Hazel buried him in the small cemetery on the ranch's eastern boundary, beside old Marcus Colton's grave marker that had been placed there by neighborly agreement years before. And Paul stood at the grave for a long time after everyone else had stepped back, with his hat in his hands and his face quiet. And Hazel stood beside him and did not speak and did not move away. Robert Fitch retired from his legal practice in 1890 and was given a celebratory dinner by the town of Rope Creek, at which Paul Granger presented him with a bottle of 30-year whiskey and a handwritten thank you letter that Hazel had written, and Paul had copied in his own hand, which was a collaborative system they had developed for correspondence that required genuine sentiment expressed with grammatical precision. James Granger, at 5 years old, showed his mother's aptitude for numbers and his father's stubbornness in approximately equal proportion, which his parents agreed was a difficult combination and also exactly right. Ruth, at 4, had decided she wanted to be a veterinarian, which was not a common ambition for a girl in 1889, but which both her parents treated as a perfectly reasonable goal and began supporting accordingly, including a correspondence they initiated with the only female veterinary practitioner they could locate, a woman in Colorado, who wrote back warmly and at length and told Ruth to keep asking questions. In the spring of 1890, they got the news that the Wyoming Territory was applying for statehood, which would be granted in the summer of that year, and Hazel sat with the newspaper at the kitchen table and read the article twice and felt something she had not expected, a deep, clean pride in the place. In Wyoming, in this particular stretch of it. It was her land now, in a way that had nothing to do with the deed and everything to do with what she had put into it. The water in Rye Creek was hers in the way that anything you have protected is yours. The pasture grass she had helped manage through 2 hard winters was hers. The ledger she had reformed was hers. The man across the room who was mending a harness with James sitting on the floor beside him, asking an unceasing series of questions about the harness construction was hers, in the full and permanent and honest meaning of that word. She put the newspaper down and looked at her family in the late afternoon light of the kitchen, and said nothing, because some things are complete without being said, and she had always known the difference between the silences that hide and the silences that hold. She was 31 years old in the spring of 1890, and Paul was 38, and the ranch was free, and the family was whole, and the books were balanced, and the land was good. And when people in Rope Creek told the story of how Granger Ranch had come back from the edge of ruin, and they did tell it, the way small communities tell stories that matter to them, they told it as Paul's story, which was right in its way. But in the telling there was always a moment, a small pause, where the storyteller would say, "And that wife of his, Hazel Boone that was," and then they'd stop and find they didn't quite have the words for the specific and quiet and extraordinary thing she had done, which was not dramatic in the telling but was everything in the doing. And so they would say simply, "She understood how it worked," which was not sufficient but was true, and which Hazel, if she heard it, would have accepted as adequate. Because she did. She had always understood how it worked, not just the ranch, not just the numbers. How love works, when it is the serious kind, the kind that is less about what you say and more about what you do at 3 in the morning when you think no one is watching. The kind that works quietly and precisely and without expectation of credit, because the thing it is protecting is worth more than the credit. Paul had known that too, eventually. He had learned it from her, the way he had learned the projection columns and the water rights law and the market rates in Cheyenne, with full attention and without embarrassment, and with the real humility that is different from the performed kind, the humility that comes from choosing to grow instead of standing still. That was the story. Not the ledger or the bank letter or the telegrams to Cheyenne or the water rights easement or the price she had negotiated above what he would have accepted. All of that was mechanism. The story was 2 people on a piece of Wyoming land in the hardest year of both their lives, each carrying something they couldn't quite say aloud, finding their way through the pride and the fear, and the longing to the place on the other side of it, where you could set things down and look at them clearly in the light. The last thing she wrote in the ledger that spring, the one she had reorganized in 1883, now worn at the corners and full of her careful columns and his later additions, and the occasional arithmetic of their children who had been given permission to practice their numbers on the blank pages at the back. The last thing she wrote was the date and the balance and the word, settled. She closed it and put it on the shelf, and Paul came up behind her and put his chin on top of her head, and they both looked at the ledger on the shelf for a moment, that worn, full, honest accounting of everything they had built. "Settled," he said, reading the word. "Settled," she said. and the Wyoming evening came down over the ranch with its particular, enormous quiet, and the stars came out above the mountains. And inside the house James was arguing with Ruth about something in the other room, and the sound of it was very loud and very alive. And Paul turned Hazel toward him and kissed her the way he had learned to fully, without reservation, without pride, with everything present that was real. And she kissed him back, and the fire was bright, and the land was theirs. And the story was complete.